Hi, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for Leviathan Wakes, which is book 1 of the Expanse series. This video is part of a series of videos where I will review every book of the Expanse series. This is all leading up to the release of book 8 that comes out this March. So every 3 weeks I will release a new video reviewing a new book in the Expanse series. I'll go through it in order, so I'll start with book 1, Leviathan Wakes. So this, I believe, is the first video I'm doing on my channel that's devoted strictly to a book review. Usually I cover TV shows. I've done a few videos about the series of videos on comparing the Expanse TV show to the Expanse novels called book to show comparisons, but what I want to do here is totally different because those focus more on directly comparing the adaptation and how they work, focusing more on the show but comparing it, contrasting it with the book. Where here I want to just focus on the book and examine each book as a whole in its own sort of right. So I guess I should start with the spoiler warning. But as long as you've seen up to the end of season 3, or even halfway through season 2, you'll be fine for spoilers if you're just a show watcher and you don't want future things spoiled for you. But if you've seen the show but haven't read the books, then I will kind of spoil like the differences between the books. So it will kind of spoil the first book, even though you pretty much know what already happened because you watched the show. But anyway, so when I do these reviews, I will try to focus more on the book, but as is inevitable, I probably will end up bringing up the show. And for this book in particular, I'm probably going to compare it to the show a lot. It's still going to be different than my book to show comparison because there I focus exactly on the changes. Here I'll focus more on the books. But I can't help myself. I won't be able to stop from mentioning the show from time to time. And the reason being is because I saw the show first. Like, I saw season 1 and season 2 before I read this book, and the entire book is covered within those first 2 seasons. So I pretty much knew like the main points of what was going to happen in the book before I read it. I often imagine what I would think of this book had I read it first, but I can't really say. And so as I was reading it, I was constantly thinking of the show, and I knew pretty much where the story was going to go, and I was constantly saying, oh, that's different from the show, oh, they did that different. So that's just the mindset. It's kind of similar when I do my episode reviews for like season 3, and I'll probably be this way with season 4 as well, because I read the books before I saw the show. So as I'm watching the show, I can't help but compare in my mind to, oh, they're doing this is different, they're changing this. So it was the same way reading book 1, but from the other way around, where I was thinking, had the images of the show already, and you just can't help that. So I can't help that from time to time I will mention the show. Now, the thing with the Expanse is, so when I was a teenager, I used to write like these really crappy, short stories and stories about set in the solar system, whatever. When I was in my 20s, I actually started to write a series of short stories that were slightly better. Well, actually a lot better. That they're all connected. They all took place in the same universe, and that universe was a solar system that was colonized. Like, it would focus on different like moons or asteroids like Europa, Io, or whatnot, and Mars, and all that sort of thing. And so that's a concept that always interested me and always fascinated me, because it seems like most science fiction would either be set on Earth entirely, on somewhat modern day or maybe near future, or it would be set like out in the galaxy, in the reaches of space, and they go to alien worlds like far-reaching, and there didn't really seem to be much that was taking place within our solar system and explored like what colonized. I mean, there was some near future, a lot of like near future sci-fi about them, the first astronauts to go to Mars or the first astronauts to go to Jupiter, but nothing about what if there's already established societies and colonies living throughout these different, planetoid bodies throughout our own solar system. And to me, that seemed like that would be a natural first step. is to, rather than, you know, going out into alien worlds, it seems like that the first thing we would do is colonize our own solar system, and it seems like a lot of science fiction skips over this. I mean, sure, you got like some sci-fi shows like Star Trek or Babylon 5, which will mention that like Mars or maybe even some other moons like Titan are colonized, but they don't really focus on that. They focus on the alien world and exploring like the galaxy and stuff like that. So this is something I always searched for, and I remember reading a lot of science fiction when I was a teenager, trying to find stuff that was set, had this sort of setting. And most of the ones I found I didn't really care for, because they were what I would call hard science fiction. Now, hard science fiction refers to like mainly novels that focus more on the science aspect and rather than character or story or like political landscapes and stuff like that. And to be honest, that's something that always interested me about science fiction. That's what attracts me to science fiction. It's mainly the exploration of societies, of the human nature, of character stories. I mean, that's kind of why I was attracted to Star Trek, even though Star Trek very infamously is horrible at its scientific accuracy. It doesn't, especially the original series, it doesn't care about any sort of scientific accuracy. It's more focused on telling allegories about our society and character studies and stuff like that. And that's actually always interested me more. Now, this doesn't apply to all hard science, mainly because some of the good hard science this doesn't apply to. But I did find that a lot of these hard science fiction novels, the characters were flat. They were two-dimensional. They were just cliche cardboard cutouts. And what actually happened, and the stories were kind of flat, cliche. They would just transplant like a mystery novel that's cliched and we've seen before all the times. Because the point of those novels weren't the characters or the story, it was the science. Oh, look at this science. This is how the science is done. So it's kind of written by scientists for scientists, and that has no interest in it. To me, I mean, I like science and all, but I'm more of a sociologist. Sociology is more my thing. I like the study of human nature, the study of societies and political landscapes and stuff like that. So I kept trying to find novels or stories set within our own solar system that colonized, that explored those aspects, and I couldn't find any. They were all like hard science stuff. And so finally, what a gem, I finally came across The Expanse. And of course, as I mentioned, my entry to The Expanse was through the TV show. But once I, started loving the TV show, I went and read the novels, and I found that these are the novels that I have been searching for. And I think the novels in particular actually do a better job than the show does of establishing this universe, establishing the world, and it feels like much more of a tangible universe. You get the more of the sense of the geography and the political landscape that's involved, and I did really appreciate that. I mean, it's a show, so it does have to sort of truncate some things, so it focuses more on the belt, which is fair enough because that is the main aspect of the story. But the novels, I think you get a clearer picture that it's not just the belt. That the reason why it's called the OPA and not like Belt First or Belters Freedom Fighters or whatever is because it's not just about the belt, it's about the outer planetary alliance. So it's basically everything outside of, past Mars, basically. So you have the belt, but you also have like moons of Jupiter, and you have moons of Saturn. And now the show does visit some of these like moons of Jupiter and stuff, but it just seems like they kind of seems like thrown in there. Whereas the show, the book, from the very beginning, from the very first book, it establishes these moons, it establishes these colonies, it establishes this world. And again, I understand the show can't necessarily do this, but that's what I really like about these novels, particularly the first one. I think the first one does a really good job of instantly getting you known, establishing the world. And that's the other thing with the show, is for a long time I couldn't get a grasp on the setting, on the universe. It was actually really confusing at first. Where the books is not. It's not confusing at all. It really, even though like the focus is even more narrow, because the novels, they're just two viewpoint characters, Holden and Miller, and you just, and for the first novel anyway, Leviathan Wakes, you just swap back and forth between these two. So it's actually a narrow focus than the books, which have all sorts of, as Avasarala as another main character, but then you see all these other sorts of like characters and flashbacks and all sorts of things that establish the universe. But even so, I think the books do a better job of really nailing down the tangible universe and getting you more familiar with it. Mainly, even though it's a narrow focus, it does, like through dialogue or through ruminations or through just explanations, they really nail down what kind of, like, it explores, like, there's moons on Jupiter that are colonized, there's moons on Saturn that are colonized, they even have remote outposts like near Uranus and stuff like that. So it makes it a lot more clear to me the kind of landscape that they have established, and so I really enjoy that aspects of the books. Now, getting into some of the characters, let's start with Miller's journey, his character story on series, because I find that is actually really different than the show. It has a different feel to it. Now, I think this was probably problematic for the show to translate, because it doesn't translate as well to show, because you have a lot of characters and situations that will basically be written off as soon as Miller leaves series. But the book actually does a good job of tying these into the later half, whereas in the show, once Miller leaves series, it's like they're gone, you never see him again. But in the books, you hear like Miller's inner thoughts, and you see that the time that he spent with Shadig or Havelock or Must all still stuck with him and stayed with him, and also Shadig and Havelock make appearances in the later part of the novel, whereas in the show, as soon as Miller leaves the series, none of it's mentioned. So it does seem, in the show, it does seem like it's kind of irrelevant. Like, why did we spend all this time establishing this series and then is pretty much forgotten? I mean, pretty much. I mean, you still follow Miller, and the purpose of it in the show, I guess, was to establish Miller. But in the books, the purpose is to establish Miller, but there's more purpose in that. It's the world building, and some of these characters even stay relevant, as I say. And now, one of the major differences from book to show, I'm sorry, I keep talking about the show, but one of the major differences is that, and again, this is the nature of episodic television, is because they split the story up into episodes and they feel they need to have like tension or some stakes within each episode to sort of keep the interest level there and keep the tension rising, where the novels is a different format, so it doesn't have that issue. So there's a lot less sort of tension or whatever, but I think that actually works a lot, because sometimes you don't need to always have, oh, something go wrong and someone's gonna die. And I think that difference is actually works better for certain characters, in my opinion, particularly Dawes, because Dawes is a completely different character in the book than he was in the show. It's like he has the same name, but other than that, it's like not even the same guy. And I actually prefer the book's version of it, because he's a smart sort of politician type, and it shows sort of the way it establishes the OPA as more of not just a band of thugs, as they kind of come off in this show, although the novels will explore the thug aspect of that a bit more later on. But I like, and it does, a lot of people treat them like they're just thugs, but then you meet Dawes, who's actually really calculated. He's actually a really good politician, and he doesn't try to kill Miller like he does in the show. He's actually, I can actually agree with him and see why he wouldn't want Miller investigating Julie Mal's disappearance. But there's another, one issue I had with the novel is that it seems to me that all the characters, like Shadig in particular, they think that Miller's a joke. And this is revealed in actually a really good chapter where he's talking to his new partner, Mus, and she finally breaks it to him that, you know, she was that everyone thinks he's a joke, and that's why he had the Earther partner, and that's why she was put with him, because she like refused the advances of Superior, so she was partnered with him as punishment. So no one wants to be with him. Everyone thinks he's a joke. In fact, once like Earth withdraws from series, Shadig outright fires him because she says, "You're unreliable. I can't trust you." And I think Shadig and all these characters doing this, it seems like they're dumb. It seems like they're being stupid and obtuse, because Miller is very much established in the novels as being a very good detective. In fact, he's the best detective. In fact, they even show him going out, like when there's riots after the Canterbury's destruction, he's going out and like leading some troops, and he's very like expertly diffuses the situation. I mean, it does show him drinking from time to time, but I think with the novels you get a lot of telling rather than showing that Miller's a drunk and that his divorce had fucked him up and he's become a bad cop, because every time you see him doing actual detective work, and not just to do with Julie Mal, as I said, even some of the other stuff with investigating the gangs and series, it seems like he's on top of things. It seems like he's smarter than any of the other detectives that are working there. And so yeah, so that's I guess the one issue, because then when they have Shadig and all these other, and Dawes and the other people treat him like he's a worthless drunk, and since his divorce and he's a bad cop and he's not good anymore, it seems like they're all stupid for thinking that, because you can see through his actions that he's a very smart. In fact, like Holden even notes this later on, that Miller was able to find Holden just by figuring out that Holden's the kind of guy who would name his ship after Don Quixote's horse. And that's what actually gets Holden to trust Miller towards the end during the Eros incident. So it shows that he's an excellent detective. I mean, sure, after he gets fired, it shows him going to Bender and he's drinking a lot and feeling sorry for himself, but he's still a good detective. So I don't know. That part of it didn't really work for me as well. Havelock and Must, again, all these side characters worked a lot better for me in the novels, especially Havelock. I love Miller's relationship with Havelock and how he's an Earther that no one else likes in Shadig, and everyone's treating him like shit, but Miller sees the value of him. And it's interesting that they actually use Havelock for the story, because Havelock goes and joins Protogen, and then that's how Miller is able to get the information on where the station is and how to attack it, and that Miller stays in good contact. And even while they're on series, like the relationship Miller and Havelock have is a really interesting, really good relationship, and I like how they are friendly with each other and they do respect each other. Whereas the way the show did it, where Havelock was kind of Miller and was treating him like shit because he's an Earther and they were at odds, it seemed like Havelock was unnecessary to the story in the show, quite frankly. So I thought they really misused him. So it was good to see how they used him here. And also Musk's inclusion in the show was very confusing. They tried to have a past romance between them, and it seemed like she just popped up out of nowhere, where in the book she wasn't as important, but she made a lot more sense, that she was just a partner who it was like, oh, she knew that it was a punishment being partnered with him, but she's like, oh, you're not so bad, you're actually, she could see the value in him, so she wasn't being an idiot like Shadig was. Anyway, let me move over and talk about the Rocinante crew. Now, this, I probably don't have as much to say about this, because this is, I think, very similar to the novel, to the show, sorry. So, not much of this was a surprise. I guess the main difference is that Holden was the first officer to begin with, whereas in the show he was only the second officer. The first officer went nuts and he didn't want to be first officer, and they didn't do anything like that. He was first officer, and as soon as the Canterbury blew up, everyone immediately started thinking of him as captain. Now, it's kind of similar to what I was mentioning before about how the show has to bring in tension. And this is something that really annoyed me, even before I read the novel. That really annoyed me was in the show they played up the feud and the disagreements between the various Canterbury survivors. Like Amos hated Holden, and they hated each other, and Amos didn't want to listen. He actually threatened to mutiny and say, oh, we should follow Naomi instead, and Alex was being a dick, and none of that happens in the book, and frankly, I like that so much better. I think that was a misguided attempt by the show to try to be more angsty or create more tension. And to be fair, I think there was just them finding their footing in the first season, because in the later seasons, they totally retcon this and have the crew act more like they did in the novels, where from the very beginning in the novels they're cohesive. And I can see how some people might think that's less interesting. And to be fair, sometimes Holden himself does come off in the novel as a stereotypical sci-fi hero stereotype, or archetype if you want to be more fair, where he's kind of could fit in any generic sci-fi story as the sci-fi hero. Although I do think towards the end of the novel they do explore his character a bit more than that. But they do kind of establish him as having a hero dynamic, and that's why the Captain McDowell tells him specifically not to be a hero. So I do actually kind of like the show's version of Holden better, where he is more of a slacker and conflicted, and it makes him less of the sci-fi hero stereotype. But so by having the crew gel and all get along well, it does make them come off as a bit more of a generic sci-fi crew. But again, I think they get more into the character dynamics interesting, and they explore each character individually. So by the end of the novel, you do have a firm sense on who Amos is, who Alex is, and who Naomi is, and they don't need to have all conflict to be fighting each other in order to do that. But it just takes maybe a bit longer to get them established. And I do particularly like how Amos is always, from the very beginning, on board with Holden, and is like treats him more like his bodyguard, and Amos is Holden's bodyguard, obviously, and so I actually do like that a lot more. In fact, I remember when I was doing my book-to-show comparisons once, and when I was watching how Amos was threatening Holden and being a dick to Holden, I said once that the book Amos would kick show Amos's ass for being such a dick. And I think that's true, and I actually prefer the book version. But to be fair to the show, later seasons they got Amos a bit better and got him right. Yeah, but the actual story of what happens with the Dollinger and all that's interesting. Like the show did a few things more out of order, but it pretty much goes down exactly the same. Now, let me get into another character who's huge. Again, it's another example. I think I like the book's version better in the show, because the show tried to create more tension, and that's Fred Johnson. Fred Johnson in the show, there's a lot of conflict between him and the Rocinante crew. Like from the very beginning, he tried to hijack the Rocinante, and Holden had to fight him off. I thought that was a cool scene, but ultimately I do like the book's version of Fred Johnson better, where he's not such an asshole. He's in the show he's portrayed more as like a shady figure, almost like an anti-hero villain type. You get these dark feelings, and he's never really portrayed that way in the novels. I mean, you do get the backstory of the Anderson Station, which actually I do like the show's version of Anderson Station better. But other than that, I do prefer Fred Johnson, and I think, or the book's Fred Johnson, I should say. And I think I like how the dynamic that he and Holden has. It's not exactly friendly. In fact, there is one point in the novels where Fred actually does threaten to take the Rocinante, but that actually comes later in the story, in what for the show would be season 2. Towards the end of book 1, when they're trying, because unlike the show, Fred knows that Holden has the protomolecule sample, and he wants Holden to give it to him, and when Holden refuses, you get this high tension scene. And to me, even though it's still the high tension and Fred threatening to take the Rocinante, to me that worked so much better. Like, that was a lot more earned, in my opinion, rather than having Fred immediately go to take over the Rocinante. And that was a very intense chapter. I absolutely loved that. That was amazing. And how, like, Fred was just like, oh, you're going to have to give me the proto-molecule. And Holden's like, hold on one second. He calls Amos on the ship. Amos, you're on the ship. If anyone tries to board, you run away. Take the ship and go away and shoot your way through if you have to. I love that. That was such a great scene. And, of course, Miller was there to talk Fred Johnson down and be the voice of reason, be like, look, I think that proto-molecule is actually better off in his hands. So I love that. And other than that, though, the relationship that Fred and Holden had was a lot more amicable. He looked at him less as a villain. In fact, Holden would keep coming back to Tycho and treating it like his home base, which I guess they kind of did in the show, but it makes a bit more sense in the novels, because they had more that friendly relationship, although there was definitely an inherent mistrust of each other, even in the novels, but it wasn't like as seen as dark or as conflicty as it was in the show. I don't know. It's hard for me to put into words, but I did much prefer it. I did really love the dynamic of Fred Johnson and Holden. The Eros incident, I do gonna have to say I prefer the, not the Eros incident, sorry. The Eros incident, I thought was very good, in the novels. It's I wouldn't say it's better or worse than the show. It's just a different perspective. Because you focus more on that, because throughout the novel you're following Miller on Ceres and Holden out, flying around the solar system, being on ships that are constantly being destroyed. And then, so you had this two-pronged story, but then all of a sudden these two prongs come together, and instead you're still switching back from Holden and Miller chapters, but you're staying with the same story because Miller and Holden are now together. And so they're on Eros, and Eros is where they come together, and you get the story of them going through this horror show, which I think comes off really good. Also, again, I think the show version was also good, but it was just different. So this is just a different perspective. It was a lot more sort of claustrophobic, because the show also had side stories like Naomi and Alex going off and Simatimba and all that other sort of thing. But the novel just focused on Miller and Holden's journey. In fact, they made it kind of implied that Amos and Naomi's stuff was kind of nonchalant, not that interesting, so that's why we didn't follow it. What was really interesting was the horror show with Miller and Holden, and you get more of them bonding. They describe the vomit zombies, and they have a lot more sort of horrific scenes that they probably couldn't get away with on a show meant to air on on cable television. So that was, and also there's a lot more stuff they couldn't do for budget reasons, because a lot of scenes with huge crowds and drawn out spaces. So it's interesting also getting that perspective in the novels. So one thing I think I wasn't as hot on with the novel is how they're always like constantly out. There's wars going on, and they had. So this is kind of what sets the book apart from the show. And to be honest, I think I prefer the show's version. Is that in the novels they established that Mars and the Belt go to war because Holden released the information about the Canterbury, and then Holden releases more information about the ships, the stealth ships that attacked the Dons are being built on Earth shipyards and stuff, and that's what starts a war between Earth and Mars, and that Earth goes and blows up Mars's moon because Holden releases information. So this becomes a huge point of contention between Miller and Holden, because Miller is really pissed off that Holden is being reckless and just releasing information willy-nilly, and every time he does so he starts a war. And it got interesting at one point where Miller's like, if you release this, you're gonna have to kill me first if you want to release this information to the public, because I will kick your ass. I'm not gonna let you do it. And so that was cool tension, but I think I kind of prefer the story without that aspect of it. And I don't know, it just makes Holden, I guess they're kind of, this novel's written in, I believe, the early 2000s, and so it's probably building off of the controversy with WikiLeaks and stuff like that, where people would just dump information out. And so this novel is sort of taking a look at exploring the consequences of just simply dumping information out there. And Holden's perspective is like, look, I'm not drawing any conclusions for anyone. I'm just giving people the raw data and they can draw their own conclusions. But Miller's like, no, because the conclusions they're going to draw is going to lead to war. So that's reckless. So it was kind of interesting getting that perspective. But the reason why I say I prefer the show's version, which didn't go this way, is because it does kind of make Holden seem a bit more reckless or immature, irresponsible, and I like how this show didn't really focus on that aspect of it. And I think the Miller-Holden relationship works better without it, just my opinion. But the other thing is having wars, having like the Belt be at war with Mars, and then Earth and Mars be at war with each other, which I know they did do in the show, but they combined in the show. They combined that more with the book 2 storyline. Which I think actually worked better, the Earth and Mars conflict I'm referring to. That in the show, they kind of started to build up during the book 1 material, but it actually got really, exploded in the book 2 material, and I think that actually made a lot more sense. Whereas here, it did seem kind of sudden and kind of like an aside, and it was more focused on the aspect of Holden dumping information, and I didn't really like that. And plus, it didn't really make much sense for me to have the Belt go to war with Mars, because Mars is obviously could overwhelm the Belt and was a superpower, and that's pretty much what was happening. So I actually did think, and plus, it didn't focus on it enough. It seemed kind of just to happen too quick, and so I didn't buy it as much. So I actually prefer the show's versions, which didn't really have this. Anyway, so the end of the novel was really, really good. It was really interesting. I think the show saw that. It saw this really good, powerful piece at the end of the novel and said, what can we do to make it better? And in my opinion, they did. And that's, of course, by focusing more on the relationship aspect between Miller and Julie Mao, which I think came off a lot better in the show. Some people may think it's a bit more sentimental or hokey or whatever. So that's fair. That's fair if you have that opinion. But maybe partly because I saw the show first, I kind of like that. I prefer that. To me, this had a lot more emotional impact than the novels did. But that being said, I still think that the novel's version of that end stretch with Eris like hurtling towards Earth was fascinating. It was a really good piece of storytelling. And again, the show wouldn't exist without this groundwork being done here. This really great story being told of, and I like how they sort of intermix with Holden, chasing Eros and having nightmares about his parents being eaten by proto-molecule. That's a missed opportunity for the show, in my opinion, having that show and seeing that nightmare. But so it was a lot more sort of clear the stakes, and having Holden and the Rocinante crew nearly being crushed to death, or stroking out from the high G's because they're trying to keep up with the asteroid. And I like it how they made it more of a conflict between Fred Johnson and Holden. Now, Fred Johnson asked Holden to basically kill himself so the Rocinante could keep up with Eris. And I like it how Holden was just like, "No, screw you. I'm not going to," and he stops the ship. That's cool. That was different from the way the show did it. I think I actually did like that. That aspect of it. I think maybe the stuff with the other UN ship with McBride and everything, especially the final chapter after the Miller stuff, felt kind of superfluous, like it was unnecessary. Like the Miller stuff should have been the conclusion of the Arrow storyline. The stuff with, oh, McBride gets pissed off because he stole the missile, so he can go after the ship and try to attack it. It felt kind of unnecessary a little bit, if you know what I'm saying. I think the interactions, though, before then were pretty interesting, but I do see why the show left that part out of it and instead made up another storyline about like these Doctors Without Borders that Holden had to kill. I actually think that worked better. Personally, but as I said, still a really good ending, and I like how like the novel just comes together all together. It feels like it's unlike the show, which tries to blend in some elements of book 2 and stuff, and add in a lot of other stuff with like Alpha Sorella and stuff. So it's trying to make it a sprawling, episodic or serialized show, which they need to do because it's a show. But the book is a nice change because it reads like a book, or like a movie if you prefer, like a singular event. And then the book 2 is like a sequel. So it's like you have Star Wars and then you have Empire Strikes Back. The Star Wars and Empire Strikes Back are telling the same story, but they're both standalone individual pieces, if you know what I'm saying. And that's how all the Expanse novels, not just book 1 and 2, but they all come off, or maybe 5 and 6 kind of blend together, and I think 7, 8, and 9 are probably going to blend together too. But I think that's because those were written after they started working on the show, so they had that show influence on them. But the first 4 novels in particular, each novel is very standalone, and I don't know, I wouldn't necessarily say I prefer it, but I do think it's interesting. It's really interesting to get that different take. Whereas book 1, Leviathan Wakes, does feel like a full and complete story with a middle, beginning, middle, and end. And I think it tells, you get that character story of Miller. In that format, you get the character story of Miller comes out much brighter because it's a full character story, where he starts out as a loser, he gets obsessed with Julie Mal, he meets up with Holden, and he sort of reinvigorates him. He finds a home, but then he gets kicked out of that home for a difference of opinion, but then he makes up for it by sacrificing himself to save humanity, and Holden helps him. And of course being reunited with Julie Mal. So that is a really good, like, clear story you get in this one piece, and I think that does really work. Anyway, my rating for Leviathan Wakes out of 10 is a 9. Excellent, a really good book. As I said, it's hard for me to differentiate my feelings of the show, which is why I kept mentioning the show throughout this review, because I saw the show first, so I can't really separate my feelings. But trying to judge the book on its own, I do think it is a complete and good story, and I do feel, had I read this book before ever hearing of The Expanse or watching the show or anything, I think I would still love it just as much, maybe even more, to be honest, because I think it does, it is a real good book, and I can see why so much has become of it. I've never read a science fiction book in recent years anyway, or even in the solar system setting I was talking about, that did it as well as this book does, and so I can see why they created a whole entire series off of this really good, strong foundation. Anyway, that is it for my review of Leviathan Wakes. As I said, I will be back every 3 weeks to review a book of The Expanse. So in 3 more weeks, I'll be back with my review of Caliban's War, and I also will continue doing my book-to-show comparison videos where I compare episodes of the show to the novels, and also I do top 10 character moments focused entirely on the show for a different character from the show, and focus on some of my favorite moments of it. So be sure to check out my channel for that. I also do many other videos and other shows like Star Trek, Game of Thrones, Lost, and more. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.